How dare you bid on an item my fiancé, Li Shixian, has his eye on? Do you have any concept of your place in this city's social hierarchy? A nobody from some remote rural backwater stepping into a high-end auction house to compete with the heir of a global conglomerate. Pure audacity. I folded my auction paddle loosely between my fingers, my expression completely neutral, zero anger or irritation seeping into my tone. I'd spent decades reading human behavioral patterns as part of my clan's training. People like Lin Zihan wield petty power and performative wealth to mask their own insecurity, lashing out at anyone they perceive as a minor threat to their manufactured status. This is a regulated public auction venue. Every registered bidder holds equal legal right to compete for lots for the house's official terms. Lin Zihan let out a shrill, mocking cackle, flipping her designer leather clutch open to retrieve a brand new smartphone. Her thumb tapped rapidly across the screen as she pulled up a locked, encrypted folder, then held the device high for every surrounding spectator to see, unlocking a series of unedited, private, intimate photographs of me captured, without consent during my solo mountain retreat last winter. The massive overhead auction screen synced wirelessly to her phone at her tap, pixelated images flashing across every inch of the display wall for hundreds of wealthy bidders, staff, and security to dissect and leer over. If you refuse to step down and surrender this lot to me right now, I'll leave these photos projected on the main screen for the entire duration of the auction. Let's see how everyone judges your shabby, uncouth rural self once they've seen every inch of you laid bare. A murmur rippled outward through the packed hall, dozens of male attendees snickering and making lewd, degrading comments under their breaths as their eyes lingered on the screen's explicit imagery. Lin Zihan preened under the collective spotlight, convinced she'd fully stripped me of any will to continue competing. Certain public humiliation would force me to abandon my bid before the lot's price escalated further. I tilted my head slightly, a faint, unreadable curve tugging at the corner of my mouth. No trace of panic or shame in my posture. Go ahead, project them for as long as you'd like. I won't withdraw my bid on account of empty threats. Lin Zihan's confidence wavered for a split second, her brows knitting tight with unmasked surprise at my complete lack of emotional breakdown. She'd banked entirely on triggering a hysterical, tearful reaction to cement her dominance over me, and my unshakable calm threw her entire manipulation strategy off balance. She quickly recovered, snapping her fingers to signal the auction tech crew to lock the photo feed to the display permanently, then reset the lot's starting bid value on the podium screen, merging the bronze cauldron lot with the private photo footage as a single bundled auction item, the base price marked at exactly 3,000,001 RMB. Now the cauldron and your embarrassing private photos are one single lot. If you lack the funds to outbid me, every stranger in this room will carry these images home on their phones once the auction concludes. She leaned in close to my ear, her voice dripping with venomous malice. A penniless peasant girl can't possibly compete with the financial power of the Li Group. Save yourself the public disgrace and back out voluntarily. I lifted my ceramic thermos from the floor beside my chair, twisting the lid open to take a slow, deliberate sip of herbal tea before speaking, my tone steady and unfluctuating. 3,000,001 yuan. The entire hall fell silent for a beat. Lin Zihan stared at me like I'd grown a second head, scoffing loud enough for the front row to hear clearly. You only added one single yuan. You're so destitute you can't even afford to raise the bid by a meaningful increment. Even street food vendors carry more disposable income than you do. I bid exactly what I choose to bid, I replied flatly, returning my thermos to the tile floor without glancing back at her. Her temper snapped instantly. She grabbed her glass mineral water tumbler and hurled it hard in my direction, the ceramic container shattering against the armrest of my chair, sharp fragments slicing thin, bleeding lacerations across the back of my palm. I didn't flinch, didn't wipe the welling blood off my skin, just raised my paddle once more, my voice cutting through her rising screen. 10,000,000 yuan, final opening count of it. Every spectator's chatter died cold in their throats. The bronze ritual cauldron's market valuation topped out at roughly 9 million at peak antique resale value. 10 million far exceeded its tangible worth, but the clan's binding ancestral contract left me with zero room to compromise. If I failed to secure the artifact, the karmic backlash from the Broken Blood Pact would slaughter every living member of the Li household within 12 months, a fate I was obligated to prevent regardless of monetary cost. Lin Zihan's face cycled through shock, rage, and desperate panic, yanking her phone out to dial Li Shixian's personal number in a frantic rush. Wait right here. Don't move an inch. My fiancé will arrive in minutes, and once he sees you challenging me like this, you'll regret ever stepping foot inside this auction hall. She paced back and forth beside my seating row, broadcasting fabricated rumors to every nearby guest, spinning a narrative that I was a delusional nobody attempting to blackmail the Li family for wealth by fabricating a false childhood engagement bond. Multiple wealthy socialites nodded along to her slander, writing me off as a low-class gold digger chasing the conglomerate heir's fortune, none bothering to verify the decades-old legal contracts stored within my private safe deposit box. I sat motionless through her tirade, my mind methodically cataloging every verbal threat, act of vandalism, and illegal privacy violation she'd committed, each piece of evidence I'd leveraged for the inevitable full reckoning once Li Shixian arrived on the scene. Every action she took only dug a deeper hole for her, blind to the ancient fate tying her beloved fiancé's entire livelihood to my family's quiet protection. The heavy oak double doors at the auction hall's rear entrance slammed open 20 minutes later, Li Shixian striding through the crowd surrounded by a retinue of bodyguards and corporate administrative staff. Every attendee rose to their feet out of automatic deference to the multi-billion-dollar enterprise's sole heir, murmurs of praise rippling across the venue as they fawned over his wealth and social influence. Lin Zihan sprinted toward him the second he cleared the doorway, clinging to his arm and burying her face against his shoulder in a performative display of vulnerability, spilling every twisted, one-sided version of our confrontation into his ear before he'd glanced my way once. She omitted the shattered glass that had sliced my hand, erased the illegal private photo projection, and twisted my competitive bid into a malicious plot to harass and extort the Li family. Li Shixian didn't spare me a single glance as he patted her back in consolation, his tone icy, unforgiving the moment he spoke, issuing an immediate violent order to his security detail without pause. Whichever hand she used to hold the auction paddle gets broken on the spot. Drag her outside, so she doesn't ruin Zihan's mood for the rest of the event. 2 towering uniformed guards advanced toward my seat instantly, gloved hands reaching out to seize my wrists. I lifted my bleeding palm up to full view, letting the thin red blood streaks catch the overhead spotlights, my voice calm, unwavering amid the chaos. This venue operates under fully enforceable commercial and civil law. You cannot deploy private security to assault registered bidders on official auction property. Li Shixian's cold gaze finally locked onto mine, his features hardening with undisguised revulsion when he recognized the faint red ancestral fate bracelet wrapped around my wrist, the bloodline marker my mother had fastened to my arm when I turned 18, the physical symbol of the century-long protective covenant his entire family owed their prosperity to. He'd known about the pact his whole life. Every Lunar New Year, his grandmother had sat him down to explain how my clan's constant fate stabilization kept their corporate empire from collapsing into bankruptcy and ruin. Yet years of indulgent wealth and shallow romantic infatuation with Lin Zihan had erased every ounce of gratitude or obligation he'd once held toward our ancestral agreement. He dismissed the bracelet's significance with a scoff, crossing his arms over his tailored designer suit jacket in a dismissive, arrogant posture. I don't care what fabricated ties you claim to our family. Zihan is my only fiancée now, and any woman who dares upset her gets dealt with harshly. Lin Zihan tilted her chin upward in triumph, her fingers interlaced tightly with Li Shixian's as she gestured toward the massive screen still plastered with my private photographs. Tell her the game's over, Shixian. Outbid her once and for all, then have security throw her out onto the sidewalk, so she can't bother us again. Li Shixian nodded, stepping forward to the auction podium and slamming his hand flat against the bid register, announcing a counter-bid loud enough to echo off every marble wall. 200 million yuan. An sane person can compete with that kind of capital. The crowd erupted into gasps and wild applause, all onlookers convinced the bid battle had concluded instantly in his favor. I stood slowly from my chair, wiping the congealing blood off my palm onto a disposable tissue pulled from my bag, my eyes locked directly on Li Shixian's face as I laid out the brutal truth he'd spent years willfully ignoring, every word a calculated revelation designed to chip away at his manufactured confidence. That cauldron isn't merely an antique ornament. It's the only artifact capable of neutralizing the karmic debt your ancestors accumulated by leeching our clan's fate energy for 100 years. If you purchase this lot to satisfy Lin Zihan's vanity and strip it of its ritual purpose, the protective bond between our bloodlines shatters entirely. Your corporate contracts will collapse, every major infrastructure investment your group holds will implode, and you personally face a violent, premature death within 12 months as the ancestral curse rebounds unfiltered. Li Shixian barked out a bitter, mocking laugh at my warning, leaning against the podium rail to sneer down at me. Superstitious peasant nonsense. I built this conglomerate through hard work and shrewd business deals, not some fairy tale fate bargain with a backward rural clan. Zihan's the only person who brings me genuine joy. Why would I sacrifice my future for meaningless ancient promise I never asked to be bound to? Lin Zihan giggled beside him, snaking an arm around his waist to lean her head against his shoulder, amplifying her dismissive mockery of my clan's sacred traditions. Listen to her rambling about curses and life or death cauldrons. She's lost her mind from jealousy of our engagement. Security. Drag her out before she spews more ridiculous lies to ruin our day. I didn't move an inch as the guards closed in again, instead reaching into my canvas tote bag to retrieve a sealed ancestral ritual document printed on aged rice paper, the official witness seals of both clans stamped deep into the parchment surface. I held it aloft for the entire hall to read, the fine brush script detailing the non-negotiable blood pact clear to anyone with basic literacy. This agreement was not my choice, nor yours. Your great-grandfather knelt before my great-aunt to beg for our fate stabilization after his shipping firm faced total liquidation and ruin. Every generation of your family swore to uphold the reciprocal protection terms until this year's celestial shift. If you voluntarily sever the bond today, you forfeit every safeguard our clan has provided your bloodline for a century. Li Shixian's jaw tightened, a flicker of genuine unease flashing across his features for half a heartbeat before he buried the emotion under a wall of prideful arrogance. He snatched the rice paper contract out of my grip, crumpling the delicate parchment into a tight ball and tossing it onto the polished marble auction floor to crush beneath his leather dress shoes. I don't recognize this outdated garbage. My engagement to Zihan overrides any imaginary obligation to a stranger's family. This bid stands at 200 million. You either back down now, or you'll be arrested for harassment when security escorts you off the premises. I watched him grind the ancestral document under his heel, every thread of the long-standing protective bond fraying further with each heavy step he took. A quiet, cold resolve settled deep in my chest. He'd made his irrevocable choice, trading his entire family's survival for temporary romantic infatuation, and I would no longer sacrifice my clan's safety to drag a man kicking and screaming toward a fate he'd openly rejected. I raised my paddle one final time, my voice clear and unwavering over the venue's buzzing chatter. 300 million yuan, and why count a bid? The hall fell completely silent for over 60 full seconds, every attendee's eyes locked between me and Li Shixian, waiting to see if the heir would escalate his bid further. Lin Zihan's bright, triumphant smile faded rapidly, panic creeping across her cheeks as she realized I held unlimited liquid assets to outspend his corporate funds without breaking a sweat. She tugged Li Shixian's arm hard, whispering frantic pleas into his ear to raise the bid higher, desperate to humiliate me in front of the entire city's elite social circle. Li Shixian's expression twisted with rage, his pride unable to tolerate being outmatched by a woman he'd written off as a penniless rural nobody. He slammed his fist against the podium again, shouting his new bid so loud the auction microphones crackled with static distortion. 500 million yuan. I'll empty half the group's operating capital to win this lot if I have to. Don't think you can compete with the Li Group's financial power. I nodded once in acknowledgement, gathering my tote bag slung over the chair beside me, my tone calm, devoid of any trace of anger or desperation. Keep the cauldron. I withdraw all competing bids effective immediately. But mark my words, once the protective fate bond dissolves entirely, every disaster I warned you about will unfold one after another, with no artifact left to mitigate the damage. Li Shixian let out a loud, triumphant cheer, wrapping an arm around Lin Zihan's waist to parade her in front of the crowd, preening under the flood of admiring whispers from the wealthy onlookers. Neither of them spared me a second glance as I turned to walk toward the venue's exit, my hand still stinging from the glass laceration Lin Zihan had inflicted minutes prior. The shattered ancestral contract crumpled and discarded on the floor behind me. The first major plot twist had fully unfolded. He'd knowingly abandoned the 100-year safety pact for a fleeting infatuation, fully aware of the fatal consequences awaiting him, and chosen vanity over his entire bloodline's survival. I'd barely crossed the threshold of the auction hall side exit when Li Shixian's voice boomed out behind me, sharp and threatening. Don't think you get to walk away from this humiliation scot-free, Zhang Xuani. Zihan still got your private photos locked on her phone. We'll circulate them to every media outlet in the city if you dare spread a single word about our supposed blood pact to anyone. I paused mid-step on the marble pavement outside the glass doors, glancing over my shoulder with a faint, detached smirk playing on my lips. Feel free to distribute them however you wish. The footage stored on that phone's encrypted storage isn't limited to my imagery alone. Lin Zihan's celebratory grin vanished in an instant, her body stiffening with sudden, unspoken panic as she clutched her smartphone tighter against her chest. She'd never once suspected I'd laid countermeasure protections against her device the moment she'd begun scheming to steal my private photographs weeks prior, slipping a tiny metaphysical data transfer rune sticker onto her phone case during a random downtown cafe encounter months earlier. An invisible safeguard that mirrored every image she captured of me onto a hidden backup partition filled with her own unedited intimate content with her secret long-term lover, a senior driver employed by the Li Group's logistics division. Li Shixian failed to notice her abrupt shift in demeanor, too busy soaking up the crowd's praise to register her silent terror, waving off my cryptic warning as empty, meaningless bluffing. She holds all the leverage here. You've got nothing to threaten us with. Head back to your tiny rural hometown and don't show your face at any high society venue in the city ever again. He spun back toward the auction podium to finalize the 500 million yuan bid paperwork, Lin Zihan trailing behind him with her head hung low, her fingers white-knuckled around her phone case as she silently prayed I wouldn't trigger the hidden data mirroring function I'd embedded into her device. I stepped out onto the sidewalk and hailed a private black sedan, sliding into the back seat and pulling my own personal smartphone out of my bag. With a single silent tap on a hidden ritual app icon, I activated the cross-screen data transfer protocol linked to her encrypted storage drive. The massive overhead auction display wall flickered once, the pixelated images of my private body vanishing entirely, replaced in a split second by crystal-clear, unedited photographs of Lin Zihan locked in intimate embraces with the Li Group's logistics driver. Hundreds of shots captured inside the corporate limousine, hotel suites, and her private downtown apartment, every frame fully visible to every guest, staff, and security guard trapped inside the hall. A collective deafening gasp rippled through the building, dozens of attendees scrambling to pull out their personal phones and record the unforeseen footage blaring across the main screen. Lin Zihan's knees buckled the second she glanced upward at the display, a shrill, hysterical scream tearing out of her throat as she lunged toward the podium's tech control station in a desperate attempt to shut the feed off. Li Shixian froze mid-signature on the bid contract, his pen slipping out of his grasp to clatter against the marble desk, every trace of smug victory draining from his face to leave behind a mask of stunned, horrified disbelief. He turned to grab Lin Zihan's arm hard enough to bruise her skin, his voice tight with uncomprehending rage as he shook her roughly back and forth. What is this? Who is that man in every single one of these photographs? Lin Zihan dissolved into frantic, incoherent sobs, unable to craft a single convincing lie to explain the reams of damning imagery now broadcast for the entire city's elite to witness. The auction's head technician sprinted over to cut the screen's power supply, plunging the massive display wall into black darkness. But the damage was already irreparable. Hundreds of cell phones had captured full recordings of every intimate frame before the feed shut down. Li Shishuan's security team swarmed the venue's front and rear entrances, blocking every exit to detain anyone who'd managed to save footage of the scandalous material, violently snatching phones out of attendees' hands and smashing them against the concrete floor without legal authorization. I watched the chaotic meltdown unfold from the tinted sedan window, the driver waiting patiently at my side to pull away at my command, no shred of vindictive glee stirring inside my chest. I hadn't sought to expose her infidelity out of petty jealousy or malice. Her illegal theft and public projection of my private imagery had activated the pre-planned countermeasure I had put in place purely to defend my own bodily privacy, a necessary self-protection mechanism I designed long before the auction day confrontation even occurred. My clan's training had drilled one unshakable truth into me for decades. Those who weaponize another person's private identity to inflict humiliation will always trigger equal, mirrored consequences for their own hidden secrets. The second major plot twist had fully revealed itself. Her own device held the proof of her long-running affair, and my pre-planned metaphysical safeguards had automatically activated the moment she exploited my stolen photos for public shame. I tapped the sedan's window control button to signal the driver to pull onto the main thoroughfare, leaving the screaming, disgraced pair trapped inside the auction hall's chaotic fallout behind me, my mind already shifting focus to the next phase of the unfolding karmic reckoning set to crash down on the Lee family in rapid succession. I'd barely returned to my quiet suburban temporary residence when my private encrypted phone line lit up, the caller ID marked with the old ancestral code reserved exclusively for Lee clan matriarch Mrs. Lee. I hesitated before sliding the call open, fully aware she was the only rational member of Shishuan's entire family, the sole person who'd spent decades understanding the weight of our blood-bound protective contract. I answered the line without preamble, letting her speak first to gauge her true intentions. Shwani, you must return to the auction venue immediately. I've rushed over alone, and I need to talk this through face-to-face before all irreversible harm settles into place. Her voice shook thin over the audio line, layered with decades of suppressed fear rooted in foretold misfortune she'd memorized from the family's ancient manuscripts. I gave a quiet, neutral confirmation and arranged a 10-minute ride back to the venue. No emotional spike, no lingering resentment clouding my judgment. My core personality as a long-trained clan heir stays fixed. I never chase petty retaliation. I only witness the natural consequences others bring upon their own choices. When I pushed the auction hall's main doors open, the chaos still hung thick in the air. Shishuan stood frozen in the center of the venue floor. Lin Zihan crumpled on the tile beside him, wailing hysterically as security guards scrambled to block every guest from leaving with recorded footage. Mrs. Lee leaned heavily on her carved wooden walking cane, her frame hunched with exhaustion after rushing across half the city alone, her gaze locking onto mine the instant I stepped through the doorway. She pushed past Shishuan and the distraught woman to close the distance between us, lifting a trembling finger to trace the faded red fate thread wrapped around my wrist, our blood bond's physical marker, the symbol Shishuan had crumpled and discarded hours prior. The binding between your clan and ours is officially broken now, isn't it? Her tone carried zero accusations, only raw, crushing despair. I nodded once, slow and deliberate, laying out every cause and effect without embellishment, every detail pulled straight from what had unfolded in front of hundreds of witnesses. Shishuan knowingly tore up the ancestral covenant document. He chose to bid 500 million for the ritual cauldron solely to satisfy Lin Zihan's vanity, fully aware this artifact is the only buffer against our century-old karmic debt. He rejected every warning I offered about the incoming wave of catastrophic losses and stood by while she illegally stole and broadcast my private photos to humiliate me in front of strangers. The agreement's reciprocal protection clause voids the second one party voluntarily abandons their sworn obligations. Shishuan snapped out of his stunned daze the second he heard my explanation, stepping between his grandmother and me to block our line of sight, his voice sharp with childish defiance. This woman's spinning ancient fairy tales to manipulate everyone. I have zero need for some outdated fate shield. My conglomerate's profits speak for themselves, and Zihan's the only person I want to build a future with. Grandmother, don't waste your energy begging a random outsider to meddle in our family's personal choices. Mrs. Lee raised her cane and struck a sharp crack against his shoulder hard enough to make him flinch backward. Her patience fully evaporated after watching his reckless self-destruction unfold before her eyes. You blind, foolish boy. I've recited our ancestors' written warnings to you every single Lunar New Year since you were 7 years old. Every profitable contract, every stable infrastructure project, every year we avoided bankruptcy, all traced back to the Zhang clan's fate stabilization work. You tossed that protection aside for a woman who's been hiding a years-long affair right under your nose. Lin Zihan's sobs cut off cold at those words, her head shooting upward, eyes blazing with panicked anger as she scrambled to her feet. That's slander. Shishuan and I spend every single day together. There's no way I'd ever cheat on him. This Zhang woman fabricated all those photos just to ruin our engagement out of jealousy. I didn't spare her a single glance. All her attention fixed firmly on Shishuan, every word heavy with the gravity of decades of foretold ruin. The bronze ritual cauldron was never meant to be a decorative trinket for your fiancé's vanity display. It was forged to absorb the cumulative bad fortune our bloodline accumulated over generations of cutting corners in business. Without it, every risky investment your father and grandfather signed off on will collapse one after another, and there's no force left to soften the blow. Shishuan's expression flickered with a tiny spark of unease, but his ego quickly smothered any flicker of rational thought. He waved a hand dismissively, gesturing toward the auction podium where the 500 million bid paperwork sat stacked. I've already secured ownership of the cauldron, so whatever curse she rants about can't touch our assets. Grandmother, stop letting this stranger's superstitious nonsense cloud your mind. This was the third major plot twist, laid bare through their unspoken inner motives. Shurxian believed purchasing the artifact alone would neutralize all karmic backlash, completely misunderstanding the core rule of our ancestral pact. The cauldron only held power if both clans upheld their reciprocal oath. He'd poured half the group's liquid capital into a useless ornament, blind to the fact its protective magic died the moment he tore up the covenant document and cast our blood bond aside. I watched his delusion unfold without interruption, letting misses. Lee carried the weight of trying to shake his misplaced confidence, while Lin Zihan clung to his arm and whispered manipulative soft words to keep him aligned against his own family's best interests. She'd always relied on his blind infatuation to shield her secrets, and she wasn't willing to let his grandmother's warnings pull him away from her side now that her affair had been exposed to the entire city's elite crowd. MRS. Li turned back to me, her voice soft with quiet supplication, the only person in this room who fully recognized my long-standing quiet sacrifices for their family's survival. Shwani, can we still mend this broken bond? I'll have Shurxian write a full formal apology, hand the cauldron over to you immediately, and arrange full financial compensation for every harm Zihan has inflicted on you today. I shook my head gently, pulling the crumpled fragments of the ancestral rice paper covenant out of my crossbody bag and spreading them across the table between us. The table ritual sealing the bond required mutual voluntary commitment from both bloodlines. Shurxian tore it apart of his own free will, and I will not reforge an oath with someone who actively chooses to discard every safety net my clan spent 100 years maintaining for his benefit. The cauldron's ritual power is already dormant, regardless of who holds physical possession of it. Shurxuan's face flushed bright red with rage, slamming his palm down hard against the marble surface of the auction table. This is extortion. I've spent 500 million yuan on this artifact, and you're telling me it's worthless just because you're throwing a petty tantrum over a bidding competition. I met his furious gaze evenly, no trace of emotion leaking into my tone, sticking strictly to factual ancestral logic without any personal resentment bleeding through. The value never lay in bronze metal or antique craftsmanship. Its power came from the reciprocal sworn duty between our two families. You abandoned your end of the bargain the second you dismissed our century-long agreement and chose to humiliate me in public. And no amount of money can restore what you've broken today. Lin Zihan tugged Shurxuan's sleeve again, her voice shrill with desperation as she redirected all blame onto me to shift scrutiny off her own exposed infidelity. It's all her fault for showing up here to compete for something we wanted. If she'd stayed in her rural hometown, none of this chaos would have happened, and Shurxian wouldn't be facing all these so-called misfortunes. MRS. Li let out a deep, weary sigh, staring at the pair side by side, finally seeing the full picture of their joint self-destruction. Shurxuan's vanity and Zihan's hidden betrayal had merged into one irreversible disaster for the entire Li enterprise, and there was no quick fix left to undo the damage they'd jointly created. I folded the broken covenant scraps back into my bag, preparing to take my leave of the venue once and for all. Before I stepped toward the exit, I tossed out one final factual observation for them both to absorb, planting the seed of the ruin waiting to crash down on their lives in the coming weeks. The bad fortune won't target just the two of you. Every employee, every investor, every distant relative tied to the Li Group's assets will bear the ripple effects of your choices. You've dragged hundreds of innocent people into your own reckless mess. Shurxian scoffed and turned his back on me, wrapping an arm around Lin Zihan's waist to parade her past the crowd once more, as if putting on a display of unbroken unity could erase every secret and catastrophic decision they'd made that day. MRS. Li lingered behind me as I walked toward the door, her cane tapping slow against the tile floor, her voice barely loud enough for only my ears to catch. I'll find a way to reach you when all this collapses. Shwani, there's nothing left I can say to pull him back from his own choices today. I gave a single quiet nod and pushed the venue's glass exit door open, stepping out into the evening city breeze without glancing backward at the chaotic, fractured family trapped inside their self-made disaster. 2 weeks passed after the auction's explosive scandal, and I stayed completely out of all city high society circles, focusing on sorting my clan's ancient ritual archives and settling overseas asset liquidation paperwork. I didn't send a single message, make a single call, or seek out any updates on the Li family. My code of conduct had always been to never actively pursue retribution. Every consequence would land on them naturally from their own reckless decisions. But the flood of breaking financial news hit every major media platform one after another, each headline a brutal confirmation of the karmic collapse I'd warned them about. The first blow landed on a Tuesday morning. Li Group's $2 billion cross-border infrastructure cooperation project was fully terminated by overseas partners, citing irreconcilable internal management risk concerns tied to Shurxuan's public scandal and unvetted personal decision-making. The stock price crashed 71% within one trading session, wiping decades of accumulated corporate market value off the balance sheet in hours. That was the fourth major plot twist. The massive contract failure wasn't random market fluctuation. It was the first tangible ripple of the broken fate bond, a disaster entirely avoidable if Shurxian had honored our ancestral pact. I sipped herbal tea while scrolling the news. No rush of joy or malice. This was simply the logical outcome of every choice he'd made that day at the auction hall. Before noon, another alert popped up. The fully completed cross-sea bridge project funded primarily by Lee Group suffered a critical structural collapse during final safety inspections, requiring full reconstruction at a cost exceeding the group's remaining liquid capital reserves. Then came word of the inland mineral mine their subsidiary controlled. A sudden violent seismic shift caved the entire ore vein, rendering the site permanently unminable, hundreds of millions in upfront investment lost with zero path to recovery. Every major asset Shershwan's family had built over a century crumbled in quick succession, exactly the cascade of ruin I'd laid out for him before he threw the ancestral contract in the trash. Half an hour later, an unknown private number dialed my encrypted cell line. IT was Mrs. Lee, her voice hoarse and cracked from days of non-stop sleepless panic. Shwani, please, I'm begging you to come to the Lee mansion immediately. Shershian is losing his mind. The company's core leadership team is all submitting resignation letters. Our investors are lining up to demand full capital refunds. We have no way to stop this downward spiral anymore. I agreed to head over only after finishing my paperwork, no sense of urgency driving my steps. When I pulled up to the gated luxury compound, the front courtyard was packed with frantic executive staff and anxious creditor representatives crowding the gate. Inside the main living hall, Shershian knelt flat on the marble floor in front of the bronze ritual cauldron he'd spent 500 million to claim, his shoulders shaking violently as he sobbed uncontrollably. Lin Zihan sat huddled on the far leather sofa, silent and hollow-eyed, her designer jewelry stripped off and stacked on the coffee table beside her. Her secret lover, the logistics driver, had formally filed a paternity test application that morning, and hospital results confirmed the child she'd claimed belonged to Shershian carried zero biological relation to him. This was the fifth and final pivotal plot twist, the last nail in the coffin of their sham relationship. The pregnancy she'd weaponized to cling to Shershwan's wealth was another elaborate lie, constructed solely to secure her position as the heir's fiancé. Shershian scrambled to his feet the second I crossed the threshold, dropping to his knees again to crawl across the cold marble toward me, hands clasped together in desperate supplication. I was blind and arrogant that day at the auction. I'll return the cauldron to you unconditionally, transfer all remaining group equity to your name, whatever you ask, just restore the fate protection bond, and save our family from bankruptcy. He rambled through a string of desperate apologies, recounting every cruel thing he'd said and done 2 weeks prior, yet his pleas rang hollow. He didn't express genuine remorse for humiliating me, violating my privacy, or discarding a century of my clan's silent sacrifice. His only motivation was terror at losing his wealth and status. I glanced at the bronze cauldron sitting useless on the display stand behind him. Its ritual energy fully drained the moment he tore up the rice paper covenant. No amount of money or surrender could reactivate its stabilizing power. The bond cannot be repaired. You made a voluntary, irreversible choice to abandon the reciprocal oath your forebears swore to my clan. This cauldron is nothing more than a plain antique ornament now, stripped of all protective ritual function. Shershwan's face crumpled completely, tears streaming down his cheeks as he grabbed the hem of my linen coat to tug at it, refusing to let me step away. There has to be some other way. I'll break all contact with Zihan, marry you immediately, dedicate the rest of my life, making amends for every wrong I've done you. A bitter, hollow laugh escaped my lips at that absurd proposal. You traded a century of your family's safety for temporary infatuation with her. Now that her deception's fully exposed and your empire is falling apart, you think marriage to me can erase all the consequences you brought down on your own bloodline? Your repentance only exists because disaster is staring you in the face, not out of genuine regret for your cruelty. Mrs. Lee hobbled over with her wooden cane, her aged face lined with deep, permanent sorrow, her gaze falling on Lin Zihan, who hadn't uttered a single word since the paternity test results arrived. This woman lied about the child she carried, manipulated Shershian for years, and triggered half the chaos that befell our household. The family legal team has already filed civil lawsuits against her for fraud and emotional damages. Lin Zihan finally lifted her head, her voice shrill and venomous as she attempted one last round of blame shifting, just as she'd done at the auction. This is all your fault. If you hadn't shown up to bid on that stupid pot, none of this would have happened to me or Shershian. I didn't waste a single breath arguing with her. I pulled out the full archive of evidence I'd preserved, screenshots of her stealing and broadcasting my private photos, audio recordings of her slanderous remarks at the auction, the paternity test paperwork, and the logistics driver's witness statements proving her long-running affair. Every disaster unfolding right now originates from choices you two made independently. I never forced you to bid hundreds of millions for a ritual artifact you didn't understand. I never forced you to violate my privacy, and I never forced you to lie about a child to trap a wealthy heir. You reaped exactly what you sowed. Shershian released his grip on my coat, slumping back onto the marble floor, all fight drained from his body. The mansion's front door swung open mid-conversation, uniformed police officers stepping inside with official arrest warrants for Lindsay, charges of illegal privacy infringement, large-scale emotional fraud, and false representation for financial gain. 2 officers stepped forward to escort her out of the estate. She didn't put up much resistance, her spirit completely broken after every layer of her fabricated identity crumbled away in front of everyone. Once the officers led her off the premises, Mrs. Lee turned back to me, her cane tapping lightly against the floor tiles as she spoke in a quiet, defeated tone. I have no grounds to beg for mercy on his behalf anymore, Shwani. The Lee Group's assets are set to enter full liquidation proceedings next week, all overseas investments written off as total losses. All I ask is that you accept the cauldron as a token of our feudal apology, even if it holds no ritual power anymore. I shook my head, declining the offer outright. I no longer require this artifact to uphold my clan's duties. The celestial fate cycle has shifted. The reciprocal protection agreement has reached its permanent expiration. You may keep the bronze vessel as a reminder of what arrogance and short-sighted infatuation cost your entire bloodline. I turned to walk toward the mansion's entryway, ready to leave this fractured family and all their self-inflicted ruin behind me for good. Shershian scrambled back to his feet and chased after me, blocking my path to the front gate, his voice raw and desperate. Where will you go after this? Can I reach you if I somehow find a method to mend the fate bond later? I glanced back at him one final time, my tone calm, unyielding, no lingering softness for a man who'd chosen to discard my clan's century of silent support without a second thought. Our two clans' intertwined fate threads have been severed permanently. You'll never need to contact me again for any reason. I brushed past his outstretched arm and stepped through the mansion's front gate, sliding into my waiting sedan without glancing back at the collapsing empire he'd single-handedly destroyed with his own vanity and poor judgment. Hashtag epilogue, true liberation and final recognition. 1 month later, news spread citywide that Lee Group had filed for complete bankruptcy liquidation, all real estate holdings and industrial facilities seized to repay mountainous outstanding debts. Shershian was forced to sell the luxury mansion and all his personal collectibles to settle investor claims, reduced to renting a tiny one-bedroom apartment in an ordinary residential neighborhood, working a basic administrative entry-level job to scrape by. He had reached out to me dozens of times via every available communication channel, sending lengthy apology letters and begging for a chance to make amends, all of which I filtered and ignored without a single reply. Mrs. Lee passed away from chronic heart failure half a year after the auction catastrophe. I sent a respectful floral wreath to the funeral parlor out of basic human decency, but did not attend the service, choosing to maintain full distance from the Lee family's tangled misfortunes. Lin Zihan received a 2-year suspended prison sentence for her fraud and privacy violation convictions, forced to take low-wage service industry work to pay court-ordered restitution fines, abandoned by both Shershian and her secret lover with no financial support to fall back on. As for me, I liquidated the last of my overseas asset holdings and founded a metaphysical cultural preservation institute dedicated to recording and protecting ancient clan covenant rituals, recruiting reputable historians and antique restoration specialists to document forgotten fate bond traditions from across the country. Wealthy industrialists and prominent business families traveled from every province to seek consultation with me, eager to learn the lessons the Lee Group's collapse had broadcast to the entire elite social circle. Long-term prosperity can never be built on arrogance, ungrateful disregard for sworn obligations, or reckless indulgence of fleeting, hollow infatuation. Every client who consulted me walked away with a clear understanding that genuine fortune and stable destiny rely on mutual respect and reciprocal loyalty, not blind pursuit of vanity or disposable romantic whims. On the opening day of my institute's grand exhibition hall, the bronze ritual cauldron Shershian had wasted 500 million yuan almost donated anonymously to our permanent antique display collection, a silent warning artifact placed front and center in the main gallery with a carved stone plaque beneath its base. The inscription etched onto the stone read, "Vanity discards sworn faith, and fortune fades with broken oaths." Hundreds of visitors paused each day to read those words, recounting the viral auction scandal that had unraveled the Lee conglomerate overnight. I stood beside the display case one quiet afternoon, staring at the bronze surface without a trace of lingering resentment or satisfaction. This whole ordeal had never been about petty revenge. I'd stepped into that auction hall solely to uphold my ancestral duty, only to be subjected to public humiliation, privacy violation, and deliberate betrayal by the man my family had shielded for 100 years. I'd remained quiet and restrained through every insult, every threat, every act of vandalism, never striking first, never fabricating evidence to destroy anyone. All their ruins sprouted entirely from their own unethical, short-sighted decisions. I'd endured all the suffering they'd inflicted without lowering myself to their level, waited patiently for the full truth to surface on its own, and ultimately walked away without clinging to any desire to watch them suffer. I'd achieved the quiet, ultimate victory. I retained my integrity, protected my clan's reputation, built a far more meaningful legacy than the Lee Empire had ever managed, and freed myself from a century-long binding fate contract I'd never chosen to enter in the first place. No longer tied to their doomed bloodline's karmic debt, I stood fully in control of my own life, my own destiny, and the legacy I chose to build moving forward. The cycle of sacrifice for an ungrateful family was finally, irreversibly over.